Welcome to this explainer. Just imagine, for a second, being a rapidly industrializing nation that suddenly wakes up and realizes it absolutely needs to control two entirely different oceans just to survive. Well, today, we're going to explore exactly how the United States pulled that off, transforming into a two-ocean global powerhouse between 1901 and 1920. We'll be diving deep into two massive overarching maneuvers from our source material: the epic, completely treacherous construction of the Panama Canal and the strategic, often aggressive, expansion of American influence in the Far East. But before we get into the actual timeline, we really need to look at what was driving all of this. The source texts reveal a really complex cocktail of underlying motivations for why the U.S. wanted stability and order on its doorstep. While they officially rejected making direct territorial claims on Latin America during this era, their policy was heavily rooted in undeniable economic ambition and political strategy. But it was also fueled by highly paternalistic, elitist, and, honestly, racist attitudes at the time. The prevailing belief in Anglo-Saxon superiority, that whole white man's burden idea, meant American leaders felt absolutely compelled and entirely justified in imposing their specific version of order on neighboring sovereign nations.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 3 presidents, 1 strategy: securing the Panama Canal, policing the Western Hemisphere, the open door in China, rising tensions with Japan, and we'll wrap up with America's new global footprint.
Let's start with Section 1, 3 Presidents, 1 Strategy. We have to begin by looking at the massive logistical nightmare the United States was facing at the turn of the century. The American economy was just exploding, right? And commercial ships desperately needed to trade seamlessly across both the Atlantic and Pacific without having to rely solely on slow transcontinental railroads. But arguably even more critical than trade, the U.S. military was building this increasingly large modern navy. Like, imagine trying to run a global empire when it takes your warships over 2 full months to travel from New York to San Francisco. Actually, during the Spanish-American War, the battleship USS Oregon had to make this frantic 14,000-mile dash all the way around the tip of South America just to join a fight in the Caribbean. That terrifying vulnerability made it crystal clear to military planners. Connecting these two oceans wasn't just a nice-to-have trade goal, it was literally a matter of national survival. Moving right along to Section 2, securing the Panama Canal. $40 million. That is the staggering sum President Theodore Roosevelt just handed over to a French syndicate, merely for the rights to start building in a disease-ridden jungle. See, a highly elaborate French scheme to build a canal there had completely collapsed back in the 1880s. They were totally bankrupted and defeated by the terrain, with over 20,000 workers dying, mostly from horrific outbreaks of yellow fever and malaria. But Roosevelt, he wasn't deterred by the devastating scale of that failure at all. He wanted that exact canal route, and he was absolutely willing to pay a premium just to get America's foot in the door. Buying those rights from the French, though, was really just step 1 of a remarkably audacious geopolitical maneuver. Actually, scratch that. It was basically a heist. In 1903, the government of Colombia, who controlled the Isthmus of Panama, rightfully refused to sell the actual land at the lowball price Roosevelt offered. So rather than negotiate further, Roosevelt actively sponsored a national uprising of Panamanian separatists. He even sent a warship, the USS Nashville, to block Colombian forces from putting down the rebellion. Within a matter of days, the U.S. recognized the independent Republic of Panama, which was effectively an American puppet state at that point, and promptly negotiated incredibly favorable terms for an extensive canal zone with this completely compliant new regime. With the land finally locked down, the United States embarked on this massive, decade-long engineering and medical crusade, spanning from 1904 to 1914. But before they could even start digging, they had to figure out how to survive. Chief Sanitary Officer Dr. William Gorgas waged a brilliant, relentless war against the local mosquito populations, systematically draining swamps and virtually eradicating yellow fever from the zone. Then came the digging. They moved enough earth to bury the entire island of Manhattan, completing the staggering engineering marvel forever changed global shipping, bypassing that treacherous tip of South America for good. It's an epic triumph that is perfectly captured in that famous palindrome: a man, a plan, a canal, Panama. Which brings us to Section 3, policing the Western Hemisphere. Now that the U.S. had this massive, multi-million-dollar canal investment to protect, they felt completely compelled to heavily police their so-called backyard. In 1904, Roosevelt essentially transformed his aggressive Latin American policy into a documented theory, which became formally known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He boldly declared the absolute right of the United States to intervene militarily for what he called, quote, chronic wrongdoing or impotence by neighboring nations. He was basically broadcasting to the whole world that the Caribbean Sea was completely closed to European powers, but it was wide open for American dominance. and nobody was going to stop them. Following Roosevelt, President William Howard Taft came in and took a slightly different approach. He called it dollar diplomacy. Taft's big idea was to avoid messy military interventions by leveraging massive American financial power instead. Think about how wild this is. Instead of sending in troops, Taft essentially executed hostile corporate takeovers of sovereign nations. For example, in 1909, Taft backed American bankers to literally buy up the sovereign debts of Honduras just to establish complete U.S. financial control over the country. It was a bold tactic that he also aggressively pushed in places like Haiti and Nicaragua. When we compare these two administrations side by side, we see drastically different methods being used to achieve the exact same goal of absolute regional dominance. Roosevelt favored the big stick, military intervention, naval posturing, and sponsored revolts. Taft, on the other hand, preferred the checkbook, financial control, debt purchasing, and deep corporate investments. But ultimately, both strategies ensured that Latin America was kept firmly under Washington's thumb. Let's shift gears for Section 4, the open door in China. So the narrative now shifts rapidly across the Pacific. While they were busy securing the West, the U.S. was also aggressively expanding into the incredibly tempting markets of the Far East. At the time, imperial rule in China was in a steep decline, fatally weakened by the Sino-Japanese War. European powers like Britain, Russia, and Germany were quite literally circling like vultures, looking to carve up China into their own exclusive, closed-off territories. To prevent being shut out of the action, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay established the open door policy in 1899. The core aim here was to reassert the principles of free trade, keeping Chinese markets fully open to American businesses and actively trying to prevent foreign powers from partitioning the nation entirely.
This built rapidly into a really turbulent decade. Following that 1899 open door note, fierce anti-foreign sentiment just exploded in China. By 1900, the Boxer Rebellion had besieged foreign embassies in Beijing, which actually forced the U.S. to send thousands of troops into a joint international expeditionary force to break the siege and restore order. From there, we even saw President Taft extending his dollar diplomacy into Asia, actively backing American financiers like J.P. Morgan to fund massive Chinese railroad projects. The United States was deeply, deeply anxious to preserve Chinese independence, at least just enough to keep those highly lucrative trade doors wedged wide open, straight through the eventual fall of the Manchu dynasty in 1911.
Next up, Section 5, rising tensions with Japan. Keeping those trade doors open in the East meant dealing with a formidable new rival. The rapid modernization of Japan, and specifically its highly efficient, deadly new navy, became a massive cause for concern for U.S. commercial interests. And those fears were totally realized when Japan completely obliterated the Russian fleet during the Russo-Japanese War. The global shock of an Asian nation crushing a major European power deeply unsettled Washington. So to balance power in the Pacific, Roosevelt stepped in and mediated an end to the conflict, resulting in the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. It was a clear, undeniable signal that the U.S. was now a primary power broker in Asian affairs. And amazingly, it's a move that earned Theodore Roosevelt the Nobel Peace Prize.
Finally, Section 6, America's new global footprint.
Through all these decisive, undeniably controversial actions, the United States successfully cemented itself as a dominant two-ocean force. Just to demonstrate this newly secured power, Roosevelt ordered this breathtaking visual spectacle. He sent 16 battleships painted gleaming white on a massive 14-month world tour. This great white fleet showcased American naval prestige and proved to the whole world exactly why that Panama Canal was so strategically vital. And the irony here is just profound. When President Woodrow Wilson took office, he officially renounced Taft's dollar diplomacy in favor of what was supposed to be a more moral and ethical policy. Yet, the pursuit of American-defined order remained exactly the same. Under Wilson, the military occupations absolutely continued. He sent troops to occupy Veracruz in 1914, ordered Marines to occupy Haiti in 1915, and sent General Pershing deep into Mexico on a punitive raid in 1916. The strategic brilliance and the sheer engineering triumph of linking the Atlantic and Pacific, combined with the economic foresight of securing Asian markets, undeniably built the modern American empire. But when we look at the sponsored revolts, the creation of puppet states, and the constant military interventions, we're left with a heavy, deeply resonant final thought. The U.S. secured its two oceans, for sure, but at what cost to the sovereignty of its neighbors? It's a foundational question about American foreign policy, a constant, tricky balancing act between national security and imperialism that we are, quite frankly, still wrestling with today.
Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the history behind the headlines.